Changing a country isn't easy, but change is inevitable. And the choices we make today will shape our country for generations to come. That's why we've published our first book from Australia Institute Press. What's the Big Idea offers 32 ideas for a better Australia, from leading thinkers such as Bob Brown, Sally McManus, Dr Emma Shortis, and Professor Brian Schmidt. The essays are a roadmap and a reminder that the solutions exist. Australia just needs the courage to implement them. Visit australiainstitute.org.au or follow the link in the show notes to order your copy of What's the Big Idea today.
After America is made on the lands of the Kure-Wurrung, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. We acknowledge that they and their ancestors have cared for the lands, rivers and sea, and all living creatures for thousands of generations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Welcome to After America. I'm Dr Emma Shortis, Director of International and Security Affairs at the Australia Institute. During his first term, we were told that we should take Trump seriously, but not literally. This term, not so much. Trump said he'd let rip with tariffs.
True to his word on the campaign trail, Donald Trump hitting his two closest trading partners, Mexico and Canada, with a 25% tariff on all goods and a 10% carve-out for Canadian crude oil.
He said he'd deport people en masse.
The Trump administration is pushing ahead with its pledge to implement the largest deportation plan, as he describes it, in the United States' history. On Saturday, the University of Minnesota said that one of its international students was detained by immigration authorities, though the student's identity and the reason for their detention remains unclear.
He said he'd let Elon Musk loose on the federal government.
Well, this is a revolution, and I think it might be the biggest revolution in government since the original revolution.
So when Donald Trump said he's not joking about staying in office for a third term, we should take him seriously.
I've raised a lot of money for the next race that I assume I can't use for myself, but I'm not 100% sure because I don't know. I think I'm not allowed to run again. I'm not sure. Am I allowed to run again, Mike?
President Trump openly talking about the prospect of seeking a third term in office. Welker says, "Sir, I'm hearing you don't sound like you're joking. I've heard you joke about this a number of times," to which the president responds, no, I'm not joking. I'm not joking.
This comes as outrage over that Signal chat debacle is growing. But while the focus is on the security and intelligence implications, the chat also included senior officials celebrating the strike itself. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz's response to the strike neatly sums up an administration that styles itself as anti-war, but is actually nothing of the sort. Just 3 emojis: fist, American flag, fire. This week, I'm joined by our friend Allan Behm, Special Advisor in International Affairs here at the Australia Institute. We discussed the Signal chat fallout, the dire situation facing Ukraine, and Australia's failure to adapt to this radically different world. Here's Allan now. Hi, Allan. Thank you for coming back onto After America.
Good afternoon, Emma. And it's lovely to be back talking to you on your show.
Thanks for joining us. Hey, Allan, we covered this issue of the Signal group chat last week, but the fallout continues. This is a huge story. And you, of course, have pretty significant experience working in defence and working in the alliance. So I wanted to start by asking you, what is your take on the Signal group chat?
I couldn't believe when I first saw the story in Atlantic that it was the slightest bit true, because just nobody who's dealing with major systems of the state, who are dealing with the systems of government, who are dealing with the lives of service people, and who are dealing with the lives of civilians who might be in battle zones, you do take all of that seriously, and you manage your messaging to ensure that you have the highest levels of discipline, highest levels of security, and the highest levels of protection for everybody who is involved in it. And so suddenly you see this whole thing out in plain language, for everybody to see. And I thought, well, this can't be true. But now we find that it's not only true, but it's actually condoned. I mean, nobody's really taken responsibility for it. People are saying, well, there's a lot of difference between classified and sensitive, or, well, it was his fault, or somebody else was in it and it wasn't me, or whatever. It's just completely without regard to the usual protocols of sound government management. And gosh, fancy that.
Well, I mean, in that sense, I guess it's not entirely surprising that the Trump administration officials would be doing this, given what we know, they think about those government systems and the way that they treat this kind of information. But what do you think it does tell us about the administration's leadership team more broadly?
Well, look, I do think that this whole episode is emblematic of the very profound change in the US governmental system, the very profound change in the way in which the world, and I mean the extended world, currently operates. And when I say emblematic, what I mean by that is that it is consistent with a world in which there is a lack of constraint on government, because after all, communications protocols are a constraint on the way in which you do business, for very good reasons. They're consistent with the whole concept of the centrality of the boss, of the leader, and that's code in some respects for the cult of personality, which you do see in similar systems, where the boss can never make a mistake. Whatever the boss does, it's right. It is also consistent, I think, with the domination of ideology over evidence as the basis for decision-making. And, of course, the cult of personality goes with that as well. And I also think that it's consistent with the total disregard for the value of anybody in the system except for the boss.
Yep.
None of the people in that Signal chat group mattered. They didn't matter to each other. They talked over each other, beside each other, underneath each other. They just talked. And ultimately, Trump says, well, so what? Doesn't matter. I'm the only one who matters. And here, let me sign a presidential directive or a minute or something and make a very sort of angular signature on the bottom of it, and that passes for government. So the way in which I'm looking at this is as though it is tantamount to a way of doing business which is so different from whatever we've experienced before and the way in which we've done business before. I don't think it's accidental. I think it is emblematic of a fundamental mindset change.
And I mean, certainly that's the argument that if this is happening in this instance, then it's extremely unlikely to be isolated. This is how the administration is conducting the business of government now. And that, of course, has really serious consequences. And I think some of those consequences have been maybe not lost, but overshadowed a bit by the chat itself and the focus on, was the information classified? Wasn't it? Who's lying? Who's not? What that is overshadowing is actually the seriousness of what is happening, which is more US airstrikes from an administration and a president in particular who continues to frame himself as anti-war. But if we zoom out a little bit, I suppose, the administration in that sense is continuing some long trends of American behaviour in the world and American militarism where, the same tactics of blowing stuff up with no real regard for the consequences or the human impact of that, and that tactic not working over and over again. This is a consistent trend, at least in the recent history of US foreign policy and US defence policy. So how do you think we explain that continuity within the Trump administration? Why does this keep happening?
Look, I think it continues to happen because of maybe for two reasons, Emma. One is the decrease of constraint on personal behaviours in the United States. I mean, people are just not constrained. The president is not constrained by anything. I mean, those of us who have been, at least in the way in which we've acted, subscribers to the rational actor theory that ultimately there is a rational explanation for everything and that leaders behave rationally, although sometimes perhaps we don't quite understand what the rationale is, that's gone right out the window. There are no rational actors here. This is not what it's about. This is working on the basis of ideology, working on the basis of a way of thinking and behaving which is not driven by reason, but is driven by impulses that are very much focused on an idea of America which is unconstrained. So it sort of really doesn't matter. Whatever the president decides to do, and we saw this in that remarkable judgment on the 1st of July last year, where the Supreme Court effectively said that the president cannot commit a crime. So the president can just act as the president wishes to act. The president is unconstrained by the law and unconstrained by anything else. And that is precisely how America is behaving now and has more and more been behaving, perhaps over the last 2 decades. Though people like me, I'd have to say, Emma, have been very reluctant to see that or to admit it, because most of us tend to think that there are good, rational ways of behaving and that there must be some explanation for all this. But to go to war and lose them all the time probably suggests that there is no rational explanation for chasing after Iraq or chasing after Afghanistan or anything else for that matter.
Yeah, and I think that, that's one of the things Trump does unintentionally perhaps, but he reveals that deeper truth, I think, about the way the United States behaves in the world, or he makes it harder to deny some of those truths. And that probably brings us to something else I wanted to talk to you about, because I know you've been thinking about it a lot, and that, of course, is Ukraine, which is something else that's, been overshadowed by this Signal group chat and the general kind of onslaught of news coming out of the Trump administration. Could you maybe give us and listeners who, are having trouble keeping up, a quick update on what is happening in Ukraine?
Well, look, it's pretty bleak for Ukraine because it really does hinge on the attitudes and policies of the United States. I mean, the United States has been effectively the leader of NATO, and the United States has set the tone for the way in which European security would be conducted. And it's done that for the last 80 years, really. Now, over the last 2 decades, American policy, I think, has suffered a tension which has now been resolved. And you could see the tension coming to a head during the Biden presidency, where the United States was very much focused on its own interests. What do we, the United States, wish to achieve out of this mess in Eastern Europe? And at the same time, a sensitivity to its traditional relationships with its former World War II partners, and I mean particularly Britain and France here. But once NATO was founded, then Germany and the Low Countries and the Scandinavians eventually. So the tension in US policy has been, well, where does Europe fit into this and what do we do for Europe? And where do we fit in this and what do we do for ourselves? That's been fixed. What the Americans do in Europe is just for themselves, and it's got nothing to do with the interests or the security of the Europeans themselves. Now, we knew that there in 2018, during the first Trump presidency, I think, the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, said
that the transatlantic alliance is suffering from brain death and that Europe cannot count on the United States for its defense.
The questions I ask are open questions that we have not resolved. Peace in Europe, post the INF Treaty, the relationship with Russia, the subject with Turkey. Who is the enemy? So until we resolve these issues, let's not negotiate cost sharing or burden sharing. Maybe we needed a wake-up call.
We might have thought that Macron back in 2018 was being a bit harsh and a bit cruel. There's no doubt about where NATO is right now. NATO has not got the United States as its leader. Britain would love to be the leader of NATO, but it sort of forfeited that when it decided to exit through the Brexit. And so it leaves Germany and France having to work out a different dynamic in their own tricky bilateral relationship. And it does remain very tricky. I mean, it's amenable to good decision-making still, but it's always been a tricky relationship. So the Europeans now are floundering. And so we get back then looking at precisely where Ukraine is now, and here's what we see. Ukraine itself, I think, is doomed, at least the Ukraine that was attacked by Russia 3 years ago. That Ukraine we will not see again, in my opinion, because the Russian-speaking oblasts to the east will be secured by Russia now. I think there's no doubt about that. There will possibly be a ceasefire built around that fact, not least of all, and also built around the inevitable acceptance, the political acceptance, that Crimea is part of Russia. And that sort of will set the precedent for what happens in eastern Ukraine. The Ukrainian economy, I think, will be a shadow of its former self. The engines of the Ukraine economy coming out of steel and coal, they're in the east. And so Ukraine will be much impoverished by a settlement. And then, of course, there's Europe. And although Starmer and Macron might think that France and Britain together can put a few boots on the ground, I'd be most surprised if that happens. I think a negotiated armistice of some kind with Ukraine making substantial concessions is now the most likely outcome if we are to see a decline in the number of Ukrainians being killed unnecessarily in the defence of their own country. So I think that for Ukraine, it's pretty dire. For Russia, it's looking pretty good.
If you didn't have our military equipment, this war would have been over in 2 weeks.
In 3 days, I heard it from Putin. In 3 days. This is something
maybe
new.
less. The problem is not that Putin is smart, which of course he's smart, but the real problem is that our leaders are dumb. I think we're doing very well with Russia. But right now they're bombing the hell out of Ukraine, and I'm finding it more difficult, frankly, to deal with Ukraine.
All Vladimir Putin has had to do is just wait it out. Did he just wait out the arrival of Trump? Well, perhaps. But I don't think that that's the sum total of his waiting it out. I think he was waiting out the inevitable fatigue that comes with fighting a war that you can't win, in the case of Ukraine, and fighting a war that has got no real benefit to yourself except keeping Russia at bay, which is all the Europeans can get out of it. And for America, they get nothing out of it at all. And now particularly with Trump as the president, because he has conceded peer status to Russia. So this is the signal of Russia's resurgence. And for Russia, it is a very, very, very important outcome because it means that Russia is back as a major global player in a way that it hasn't been since the fall of the Soviet Union. And I think the return of Russia to the main stage is significant because it puts into play, again, a major power that has got entirely different strategic and political and cultural objectives from those that the countries of the West, so-called, have in mind. And that is a significant thing. And yet it does not show up at this point in Australian policy. And I think Europe and the United States have yet to adjust to what has happened in Russia and what's happened in Europe. And I think that's a very, very significant thing.
Allan, you mentioned Australia, and of course I'd like to come back to that. But before you do, I'd also like to ask you, very much in that context of a resurgent Russia, about the role of China in all of this, and particularly what the implications are for Russia's relationship with China, which is often dramatically oversimplified, but also the implications for potentially, I suppose, for our region, given things are shifting so quickly.
Well, China, of course, is and should be front and centre of Australian policy because we live in Asia and China is evidently the dominant Asian power. China, in my reading of China, is a status quo power. I don't think that China is particularly an expansionist power. It's a very cautious power. And as it observed what was going on 3 years ago with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, initially China was, I think, a bit worried about this because it couldn't see quite where that was going to go and whether the European and American alliance and cohesion on the matter might well diminish the power of Russia in a way that didn't work to the advantage of China. And I think it was that kind of consideration that led President Xi to visiting Moscow and then making his very extraordinary and not yet repeated statement about eternal fraternity between China and Russia. We've not heard that anymore. And I think we haven't heard that for very good reason, because I think China now sees that what has actually happened, but particularly the emergence from this conflict of a much stronger and resurgent Russia, is actually not in China's interest at all. I think what China now sees is that its historical competition with Russia has to be back in play, and it's now got to think about how it maximises the disadvantage that Europe and potentially America experience and how it can minimise the advantage that Russia now has. But I think it's also probably drawn quite an important set of observations about what happens when you do attack a third party, as Russia has, and what really happens to you. I think China would be extremely interested in the fact that NATO has not been able to defend Ukraine. And that plays right across into the Taiwan problem as it exists for both China on the one hand and for America to the extent that it still exists for America on the other. And I think China would have taken heart from that development in the same way as I think it's probably taken heart from the fact that a resurgent Russia will create further problems in Central Asia as the independent republics in Central Asia learn once again how they're going to have to deal with a dominant Russia. They've had quite a good time in the last 20 years because they've been able to assert much more independence. China will be manoeuvring them as quickly as it can to much closer relationships with China in order to deal with Russia. And that in its turn, I think, will have an impact on the way in which overall China conducts itself, not only to its west, but also to its south. And so for those reasons, I think that China also emerges from the event in Ukraine in a somewhat stronger position than it might have been 3 years ago when that war began. Now, that's yet to be tested, of course, but if I were the people of Taiwan, I don't think I'd be holding any particular hope that the American fleet will come sailing over their eastern horizon to save them against some onslaught from China. It's not that I think there will be an onslaught for China, but I think as for Ukraine, so over time, the position of Taiwan will also move much more closely into China's sphere of influence and control.
Do we have a guarantee that the US would defend us as an ally?
We do, because we have an ANZUS agreement, an alliance with the United States.
And you think that's rock solid?
Yes.
We are very encouraged by the strength of American leadership, as demonstrated by the comments of Secretary Hegseth and indeed others in the Trump administration. We talked about AUKUS and how fundamentally important it is in the contemporary expression of our alliance.
Allan, all of this is happening, of course, now in the context of an Australian federal election, the date of which was announced this morning at the time of recording. So this is probably an unfair and general question, but how do you think all of that plays into an Australian election campaign?
It probably doesn't really play into the election campaign because we are fat, happy and complacent as a country. And we're much more...
Speak for yourself.
Thank you very much. Much more inclined to fight about petrol prices and Coles and Woolies prices than to think about what the more fundamental changes in the economic structures of the world coming out of tariffs on cars, changes to the way in which industry might operate in Europe and North Asia and so on. There were in the Treasurer's budget this week some subterranean sort of rumblings, but no real recognition of that fundamental change in the way in which, at the political and strategic levels, the world is operating, follow the swearing in of President Trump. We've had a couple of months of that now, and it is becoming clearer by the day that we are living in an entirely different world. And that is a world that we are going to have to come to terms with. And I think rather than seeing it in terms of our immediate electoral processes, it becomes a major issue for an incoming Australian government. How does an Australian government respond to what's happening in Eastern Europe, and how does it respond to what is progressively occurring in Asia? How does it respond to an entirely different US administration? As I said much earlier, an unconstrained American administration, which, far from being cut off from the world, it's not isolationist. It's a dominant administration, but pursues only its own interest. And so as we look at the fact that NATO doesn't really work anymore because the Americans are not prepared to put themselves at risk for Europe, and regards Europe as an embuggerance anyway, to what extent then is Australia's long-term adherence to ANZUS as not only the keystone of our security policy, but, in the words of the Deputy Prime Minister, the cornerstone of our foreign policy? And for that reason, I think we're going to have to conduct a really fundamental recalibration of how we think about ourselves in the world. Now, that's a matter that you and I discuss all the time. And, we've got a few views about it, but it would appear that our views at this point are hardly reflected at all in any of the remarks being said by senior ministers. But in the very first instance, Australia has got to work out what on earth it actually stands for and what it wants. It's going to have to work out, once it does identify what it wants, what its interests are, how it's going to go about securing those in the absence of a dedicated supporter in the US. And if we are now going to need to operate not so much independent of the United States, again, you and I have discussed that a hell of a lot, and we're very close to the United States for reasons other than defence, and that will continue. But to work in a much more self-directed way, a way of much less, shall we say, reflection of US policy, but a way of bringing our own policy interests into the conversation with the United States. And that's going to require a lot of hard work. First of all, we've got to work out what it is we want, and then we've got to work out how we're going to go about securing it. And that then puts a big emphasis on the quality of our diplomacy over the next 5-10 years. It's not just a diplomacy directed towards Washington, it's a diplomacy directed towards our immediate neighbourhood. And I think that's going to be a big shock for Australia. The realisation of it tests very fundamental assumptions about our security and our foreign policy, not, I hasten to add, assumptions about America. These are assumptions about ourselves. And that, I think, is what we are not yet prepared for. And I worry that we're not at the moment quite capable of doing it, because I don't know that we know quite enough about ourselves even to work out what it is that we want.
Allan, those are enormous foundational challenges, really, for Australian politics that are not easy to tackle. Again, it's possibly an unfair question, but how do you think an Australian government or Australian polity more broadly might begin the process of attempting at least to answer those questions?
Look, Emma, that is a really big question, and it's one that, I mean, we'd need many sessions to work out how even to tackle it. But from my perspective, Australian policy generally, and here I'm talking about every field of Australian public policy, domestic policy as well as international policy, is subject to really serious internal constraint because of the limiting factors that we are not prepared to address. They're hard to talk about because they're embarrassing and difficult. But it's my view that as a country we face, in common with a lot of other countries, this is not a unique situation, it's just that we're very slow to address them. We face a set of interconnected pathologies that limit us from achieving the enormous potential that we have as a country. And very briefly, I think that they hover around things like racism, misogyny, insecurity, an inability to self-affirm. You know, we need to be validated elsewhere in order to be confident enough to project our own views. We're afraid of being abandoned. We don't like the idea of being isolated. All of those things play off each other and make us very uncertain as to how we might be able to act. The best way to address those things is to recognise them. And once you've recognised them, I think you're well on the way to being able to have that kind of broader, and one hopes calm conversation about, well, what do you do to deal with the big issues of racism in this country? Because they are big. They're not killing us, but they're limiting us. The issues of misogyny, which are deeply structural in Australia. And I would say 50% of the population would immediately agree with me that 50% of the population is constrained by structural misogyny. If there's a woman who disagrees with that, well, maybe there's a vice-chancellor somewhere who does, but for the rest, I really don't know. But I do think that issue of structural misogyny is one of the great limitations on our national power, and so on. So first of all, recognise those things. The second thing is I would love to see a government stand up and say, these are the critical principles on which we are going to conduct our foreign policy. We actually do believe in the international rule of law. We do accept that international rule of law is based on the individual dignity of human beings, that the state exists to protect human beings, not the other way around. I do think that we need to have a policy which recognises that we live in a neighbourhood and that our neighbourhood is full of fabulous countries, and yet of them we know very little. We don't speak their languages. I was at a conference just this week, reverting to our Russia discussion, where we were talking about Russia as a resurgent power, and in the room, the average age of the people there who could actually speak Russian was 60. And there were only 4 of them. We don't even speak Russian, and yet we've had Russian migration into Australia since the 1850s. So it's really important for us to establish the principles on which we want to live in a neighbourhood and how we have a neighbourhood that works towards common purpose. And that's not about warding off China and fighting China. It is about understanding that all of us are caught in a region, we live in a region where the dominant power is China, and we've got to know how to deal with that. So articulate the principles on which we run our foreign policy and a fortiori, the principles on which we run our defence policy. They're very big tasks, but they're the tasks we need to do if we're to adjust properly to this fundamental change in the world order that we were discussing a bit earlier.
They are fundamental challenges, Allan, but I can't think of anybody better to discuss them with than you. Thank you so much, as always, for your time and your generosity.
Thank you, Emma.
If you're enjoying After America, please leave us a rating and review on your podcast platform of choice. It makes a big difference. This episode was recorded on Friday, the 28th of March. No doubt a bunch of stuff will have happened since then. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation and produced by Angus Blackman. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. We'll be back next week. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.